13 of the most lethal snipers in the United States military lined up at Redstone Tactical Range, and every single one of them missed. The target sat nearly 4,000 meters out, over 2.5 miles, swallowed by heat shimmer and desert wind that changed direction every 30 seconds. General Raymond Holt stood at the observation line with his jaw locked, watching his best people fail in front of a federal evaluation team that had flown in specifically to greenlight the Phantom program. Then a woman in a medical logistics uniform stepped out of the back of the crowd, raised her hand, and said quietly, "Sir, may I try?" Nobody laughed at first, they just stared. Then somebody did laugh, and it spread. Before you find out what happened next, I want you to do something for me. If you're watching this story for the first time, hit that subscribe button and stay until the very end, because this one doesn't let up. Like this video and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The desert outside Callaway, Nevada did not care about reputation. It did not care that Lieutenant Derek Sauer had qualified as the top long-range shooter in his battalion 3 years running. It did not care that Specialist Marin Tusk had set a range record at Fort Diaz that still stood. It did not care that Warrant Officer Philip Rohn had been personally recommended for the Phantom program by a 2-star general who called him the most gifted natural shooter he had ever evaluated. The desert had its own rules, and on the morning of the assessment, those rules were merciless. The wind at Redstone Tactical Range came in from the southwest in unpredictable bursts 16 miles per hour, then 0, then gusting to 30 without any pattern a scope or a sensor could reliably predict. The heat index at 900 hours was already pushing 102 degrees Fahrenheit, and the mirage effect over the dry lake bed between the firing line and the target reduced visibility in the kill zone to something close to a hallucination. You could see the target stand. You could not be certain you were seeing it clearly. The target itself was a regulation Phantom program evaluation plate 40 centimeters across, positioned at 3,947 meters. For reference, most combat engagements happened inside 800 meters. Some elite units trained out to 1,500. The Phantom program was something else entirely. It was a classified federal initiative designed to place trained precision shooters in environments where conventional military assets could not operate, and its entry threshold was not a score. It was a single condition. You either hit the plate under field conditions, or you didn't qualify. No second chances. No partial credit. General Raymond Holt had overseen the selection process for 2 previous Phantom cohorts. He had never seen a perfect qualification day. He had always expected some attrition. What he had not expected was a complete shutout. 13 shooters. 13 misses. In 2 cases, the evaluation team wasn't even certain the rounds had landed in the correct sector. He stood at the observation post with his binoculars pressed to his face long after the last shot had been fired, looking at an undamaged target plate that shimmered in the heat like a mirage of its own. Behind him, the federal evaluation team, 4 civilians from the Office of Strategic Capabilities, led by a lean woman named Director Alicia Fenn, had stopped writing in their notebooks. That was not a good sign, General. It was Captain Dolores Wash, his aide, who spoke first. "We're at time. Do you want to call the assessment?" Holt didn't answer immediately. He lowered the binoculars. His jaw moved like he was chewing on something he couldn't swallow. That was when he heard the voice from somewhere behind the cordon rope. "Sir," it was quiet, not aggressive, not pleading. "Just present. May I try?" He turned. Standing at the edge of the observation area on the wrong side of the yellow rope that separated authorized range personnel from everyone else was a woman in ACU trousers and a medical corps insignia on her chest. She was holding a cup of water and a clipboard. She had been standing near the mobile field clinic tent since 730. Holt had noticed her earlier when he'd walked past, and his brain had filed her away as part of the support staff. Medical logistics. Supply. The kind of person who kept the range running but never touched the weapons. She looked to be in her mid-30s. Medium height. Nothing remarkable about her posture except that it was very still. Her name tape read Hartwell. One of the shooters, Lieutenant Derek Sauer, turned around and stared at her with the particular contempt that certain people reserve for those they've already decided don't belong. "Kidding," Sauer said. "Not to her. To nobody in particular." He said it the way you might comment on a flat tire. A minor absurdity in an already bad day. Holt looked at her for a moment. Then at Fenn. The director's expression had shifted not much but enough. She was watching the woman in the medical corps uniform with something that wasn't quite curiosity. Closer to attention. "Who are you?" Holt asked. "Captain Nora Hartwell, sir. Medical Logistics, Support Detachment." I've been managing equipment inventory for the range setup since Monday. And you want to fire the evaluation shot? Yes, sir. Do you have a long-range qualification on record? Paused just briefly. My most recent qualification on file is from 4 years ago. Standard M24 qualification course passed. Sauer actually laughed then. A short, sharp sound. Standard M24 qual at 400 meters. She wants to shoot a 4,000-meter evaluation plate. He looked at Warrant Officer Roan, who was shaking his head. Someone needs to explain to the medical staff how far 4,000 meters actually is. You can walk it if you want, Hartwell said. She wasn't looking at Sauer. She was looking at General Holt. The general studied her face. He had a habit, built over 30 years of command, of looking at people when they asked for something they shouldn't reasonably be asking for. Most people, when they asked for something outside their lane, had to tell a slight overbrightness in the eyes, a tension in the jaw, performance of confidence instead of the thing itself. Hartwell had none of that. She looked calm the way certain very experienced people looked calm, not the calm of someone who had never felt fear, the calm of someone who had learned to leave it somewhere else when it wasn't useful. Captain, Holt said slowly, if you touch that rifle and fire a round downrange, I am obligated to log it in the assessment record. You understand that? Yes, sir. And you still want to do this? Yes, sir. He looked at Fenn. The director gave him nothing, just that same attentive expression. He looked at Wash. His aide gave him a microscopic shrug. All right, Holt said. Step up. The reaction from the assembled range personnel was immediate and varied. Several of the qualifying shooters simply turned their backs. Sauer stayed where he was, arms crossed, watching with the expression of a man determined to be unimpressed. A pair of junior enlisted soldiers near the supply tent were less subtle. One of them pulled out a phone before a sergeant barked at him to put it away. Hartwell crossed under the rope, set her clipboard and water cup on a folding table, and walked to the firing station. The rifle laid out on the shooting mat was a custom system, a precision bolt action, chambered in 0.408 Cheyenne Tactical, mounted with an advanced ballistic scope and a laser rangefinder unit. It was not a standard issue weapon. It was the kind of equipment that usually came with a 6-figure price tag and a career's worth of specialized training behind it. Hartwell knelt beside it. She did not pick it up immediately. She looked downrange. At that distance, the target plate was essentially invisible to the naked eye, a theoretical object in a shimmer of heat distortion, somewhere past the berm line and the dry lake bed, and the 2 miles of open Nevada desert. The wind was moving from left to right at that moment, carrying a thin plume of dust from the access road. She watched it. She tracked it with her eyes, then looked away, then looked at it again. Picked up the rifle. Her handling of it was the first thing that changed the tone in the observation area, not dramatically, but perceptibly. She didn't fumble. She didn't have the careful, self-conscious deliberateness of someone unfamiliar with a weapon. She moved with the efficient, low-motion economy of someone who had done this 10,000 times, or something close to it. She checked the chamber, confirmed the round was seated, adjusted the bipod by a 1/4 inch, and settled into position. Warrant Officer Roan, who had been standing with his back partly turned, slowly rotated to face the firing station. Director Fenn took a single step forward. Hartwell put her eye to the scope. What happened in the next 4 minutes looked, from the outside, like almost nothing. She lay still, completely still, in a way that wasn't performed or dramatic, just functional stillness, the kind that came from years of training the body to become an instrument. Her breathing slowed. She made 2 small adjustments to the scope turrets with her right hand, tiny fractional rotations. She watched the wind. She waited. The wind dropped. She fired. The report was sharp and hard and then gone, absorbed by the open desert. 4 seconds past the approximate flight time of a round at that distance and velocity. Then, from the far end of the range, the faint mechanical ring of metal on metal. Everyone heard it. The desert was quiet enough that you could hear it, that thin, distant tone that meant the round had found the plate. The evaluation team's spotting scope operator, a young specialist named Ortega, had his eye pressed to the glass. His voice, when it came, was absolutely flat with shock. Hit, he said. Dead center. Nobody moved for a moment. Then everybody started talking at once. Chaos that followed was not the celebratory kind. Sauer was the loudest. That doesn't count, he said. His voice had gone tight in a way he probably didn't hear. The evaluation protocol requires a documented qualification history. She said her last qual was 4 years ago on a standard course. That's not a phantom program qualification. That shot doesn't count under the program rules. He's right about the protocol, one of the other shooters said. Tusk. Her voice was quieter, but she was nodding. The OSC has strict entry requirements. A field shot from an unqualified shooter during the evaluation window. I didn't say it counted, Holt interrupted. His voice carried enough weight to stop both of them. He was still looking at Hartwell, who had risen from the mat, and was field stripping the rifle with the same economical precision she'd used to pick it up. I said I'd log it. I didn't say anything about program entry. Director Fenn had moved. She was standing beside Holt now, and she was looking at Hartwell with an expression that had shifted considerably from the careful neutrality she'd maintained through the entire failed qualification session. Captain Hartwell, Fenn said. What's your full service record? Hartwell set down the rifle's barrel assembly and looked up. Standard file, ma'am. 7 years active duty. Medical logistics, primarily. 2 overseas support deployments. Primarily, Fenn repeated. Specific word choice. Hartwell said nothing. Where did you learn to shoot like that? Another pause. Shorter this time, but Holt caught it. I trained, Hartwell said. A long time ago. Fenn studied her. I want to pull your full service jacket. That's your prerogative, ma'am. The director turned to one of her team. Get me everything on Captain Nora Hartwell. Full record. Any classification flags, I want to know. The team member, a young man with a laptop bag who looked like he'd wandered in from a congressional office, nodded and started moving. Sauer stepped forward. Sir, he was addressing Holt now, and his voice had dropped to something that was trying to sound professional. With respect, whatever she did downrange just now, it needs to be investigated. Conditions where someone could argue the wind dropped at exactly the right moment. One shot isn't a pattern. The protocol exists for a reason. Holt looked at him. Thank you, Lieutenant. I know why protocols exist. Sauer held his ground for a second longer than was wise, then stepped back. Hartwell had finished with the rifle. She picked up her clipboard and her water cup. Am I dismissed, sir? She asked. Holt looked at her with the measuring expression he'd been wearing since she first spoke. No, he said, you're not. Stay on post. I want to know where you are. What Nora Hartwell did that evening was unremarkable. She returned to the medical logistics tent, updated her equipment inventory, filed a supply requisition for 2 replacement IV kits that had been opened during a range heat casualty incident that morning, and ate dinner at the support staff mess alone, at the far end of a table. She did not talk to anyone about what had happened on the range. She did not check her phone for messages, though she had 3 unread notifications from a number she recognized and had been deliberately not reading for several days. She drank 2 cups of bad coffee and read a worn paperback that she kept in the side pocket of her kit bag, the cover so faded you couldn't make out the title anymore. To anyone watching, she was exactly what her personnel jacket described: a quiet, competent support officer doing her job and keeping to herself. What no one in the support mess knew was that Captain Nora Hartwell had not slept more than 4 hours straight in 11 days. The insomnia had started before the range deployment. It always started the same way, not nightmares, which would have been easier to dismiss. Just a specific quality of wakefulness in the hours before dawn, when her mind replayed distances and calculations, and the sound of a spotter's voice in her ear from years ago. A voice she couldn't make herself stop hearing if she was too tired to fight it. She finished the coffee, packed her paperback, and walked back to the berthing tent. In the bunk above hers, a young medic named Castillo was already asleep, one arm hanging over the edge. Nora sat on the edge of her bunk and unlaced her boots carefully so the zipper on her kit bag wouldn't make noise. She opened the bag. At the bottom, beneath the rolled socks and the spare uniform and the medic supplies, was a small laminated card, military ID size, worn at the corners. She didn't take it out. She could see just enough of it in the dim light. Closed the bag. 4 hours of bad sleep. That was something. The next morning, she found out she was being investigated. Not officially. Not yet. But when she arrived at the equipment tent at 600, her access credentials had been changed overnight. She couldn't pull the supply logs she needed to complete that day's inventory without a new access code, and when she went to the range operations desk to request one, the NCO on duty gave her a look that communicated very clearly that something had shifted in her status without anyone bothering to tell her directly. I'll need to get authorization, the NCO said. I'll put in the request. For a supply log access code, Nora said. Ma'am. She went back to the equipment tent and did what she could without system access. She counted physical inventory by hand, cross-referenced it against the paper backup manifests, and documented 3 discrepancies that should have been caught 2 days ago by whoever had processed the Tuesday intake. At 8:30, Lieutenant Sauer appeared at the tent entrance. He didn't come inside. He stood in the entrance with his arms at his sides, and his expression carefully composed into something meant to look like official concern. Captain Hartwell, he said. I wanted to make sure you knew what happened yesterday is going to go to a review board. The OSC team has questions about the assessment window and whether standard protocols were followed. I know, she said. You should probably have your record in order. She set down her clipboard and looked at him. My record is in order, Lieutenant. Just mean. He stopped, recalibrated. Some of the documentation in the range files shows a discrepancy in the medical supply inventory from last week. Missing items. It was flagged by the logistics officer. She felt something tighten in her chest, but her face didn't move. What discrepancy? 4 cases of IV solution log as received, not in physical inventory. I can show you the intake manifest right now, she said. Those cases were logged as delayed in transit. I documented it myself on Tuesday. The file shows they were logged as received. She looked at him steadily. Then someone altered the file. A beat of silence. Sauer smiled small, controlled, almost apologetic. I wouldn't throw accusations around, Captain. Not right now. Given everything, he let that hang. Then he left. Stood in the tent for a moment after he was gone. Outside, a vehicle moved along the gravel access road, raising a thin cloud of beige dust. The desert was already heating up, the air near the tent entrance wavering slightly. Picked up her clipboard. If someone had altered the inventory files, they had done it within the last 48 hours because she had personally verified the documentation on Tuesday at 1700. That meant they'd had access to the logistics system, which required a range operations clearance she didn't have, but since Sauer did. He'd been assigned to range operations support for the last week. She needed the paper backups, not copies originals with the date stamps. Those were filed in the range operations office, not in her tent. She had maybe 12 hours before someone decided the discrepancy was enough to pull her credentials entirely. The range operations office was a prefab structure at the north end of the facility, technically accessible to all personnel with a base access badge, though in practice it was Sauer's territory. Nora walked there at 19:15, during the window when she knew the morning debrief would have most of the senior staff occupied in the main briefing room. She signs in at the desk. The duty clerk, a young private first class, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, pulled up the access log without complaint. Supply manifest backups, Tuesday intake, Nora said. Paper files, medical logistics section. I'll need to pull them from the cabinet, the clerk said. Give me a minute. While she waited, Nora looked at the visitor log. She wasn't trying to look. The book was open on the desk in front of her, and she had good eyes. And the entry from last night was right there. Sauer had signed in at 2,247. After hours. He'd logged his purpose as document review range assessment prep. 2,247, the range assessment had been over for 14 hours. Clerk came back with a manila folder. Nora took it, opened it, and found exactly what she'd expected, the original Tuesday intake manifest, with her own handwriting, showing the IV solution cases as delayed transit items, the transit documentation attached. Also found, clipped behind it, a second document she had never seen before. A revised intake form, dated 2 days earlier than the original, that showed the same IV cases marked as received and then listed as discrepancy items not located at verification. Her name was on the revised form as the signing logistics officer. Her name, in a font that was close to her handwriting, but wasn't. She stood there for a moment with both documents in her hands. Everything okay, ma'am? The clerk asked. Fine, Nora said. I'm going to need to photograph these for my records. Do you have a scanner? She photographed both documents. She photographed the visitor log entry for Sauer's after-hours access. She did it methodically, without rushing, and she thanked the clerk on the way out. She walked back to her tent in the full heat of the Nevada morning, with the photographs on her phone and the knowledge that she was looking at a deliberate, documented attempt to falsify records and put her name on them. Question was why. She'd been on this base for 9 days. She was a logistics officer. She had almost no intersection with the sniper qualification program, or she hadn't until yesterday, until she'd picked up that rifle. She sat on her bunk and thought about it carefully, the way she'd learned to think about problems that were simultaneously tactical and deeply personal. Stripped it down. She laid out the components. Sauer had been there when she fired the shot. He'd protested immediately loudly in front of the OSC team. He had access to the logistics system. He had entered the range operations office after hours. The falsified document bore a date that, if accepted as genuine, would have created a record of negligence predating her decision to step up to the firing line, making it look like she'd been under investigation before the shot, would retroactively undermine anything she said or any qualification she might claim. This was not improvised. This was done by someone who had thought ahead. which meant Sauer, or someone working with him, had already been thinking about what to do if someone they hadn't planned for stepped onto that firing line. She thought about the 11 days of insomnia. She thought about the worn paperback and the laminated card in the bottom of her kit bag. She thought about a voice in an earpiece saying wind shift. Hold, hold, hold now from what felt like another lifetime. Pulled out her phone and, for the first time in 11 days, opened the unread messages. The first one, sent 9 days ago, read, "They're running the Phantom evaluation at Redstone next week. You know that range. You should be there." The second, sent 5 days ago, Nora. "Someone's been asking about your service record. Not the public file." Third, sent yesterday at 1,932. 4 hours after she'd fired the shot. "I heard what you did today. Tell me you have documentation." She read all three. Then she sat still for a moment, looking at the tent wall. Then she started typing. The reply came 20 minutes later, while she was eating a dry granola bar and staring at the falsified documents on her phone screen. The message was 3 words, "I'm already moving." And below that, a second line, "Don't talk to anyone in command until I get there." She set the phone down. Outside the tent, she could hear voices from the direction of the range operations office, multiple voices. One of them Sauer's, the cadence of someone giving an explanation that was working too hard to sound casual. She didn't know yet that Director Fenn's team had already submitted a records request to the Department of Defense Personnel Archive for her full service jacket. She didn't know that the request had hit a classification flag, not a standard one, not a routine security clearance hold, but a specific flag attached to a specific program that hadn't officially existed and still technically didn't. She didn't know that the flag had triggered an automatic notification to a small office in a building in Northern Virginia, and that the notification had generated a call, and that the call had gone to someone who picked up on the first ring. What she knew was the tent and the granola bar and the sound of Sauer's voice carrying in the desert heat. She thought about the target plate ringing in the distance. Thin, clean sound of it, the way the spotter had said hit like he couldn't believe his own ears. She thought about all the things she had taught herself not to remember, and how badly it turned out that some things did not care whether you were finished with them. She folded the granola bar wrapper, tucked it in her pocket, and picked up her clipboard. There was inventory to count. She was going to count it. And somewhere on the other end of that 3-word message, something was already moving toward Redstone Tactical Range that Lieutenant Derek Sauer had not planned for and could not stop. He had falsified documents. He had a timeline. He had no idea what she used to be. The inventory took 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was about an hour longer than it should have, because her hands weren't quite steady, not visibly. Anyone watching her move through the equipment tent would have seen a logistics officer doing her job with methodical precision, checking item codes against paper manifests, annotating discrepancies, stacking supply crates back in the correct order. The shakiness was internal, the kind that lived in the chest and the throat, and didn't make it to the surface if you'd spent enough years learning to keep it there. She'd learned young. She'd had good teachers. She finished the count at 1,247. Every item matched the original intake manifests. Every item except the 4 cases of IV solution that Sauer's falsified document claimed she'd lost track of, and those, per the actual transit records she'd photographed at the operations office, were sitting in a staging depot 40 miles north, delayed by a courier error that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with a clerical mistake at the supply chain hub. She had the documentation. She had the dates. She had Sauer's after-hours access log entry. What she didn't have was anyone in her chain of command who was going to care before someone decided the falsified record was enough to pull her credentials and flag her for misconduct review. She was thinking about that, specifically about how much time she had and what she could do with it, when Castillo appeared at the tent entrance, her young medic colleague, still wearing the slightly dazed expression of someone who'd spent the morning on range heat patrol. "Sarge wants to know if you're coming to the briefing," Castillo said. "What briefing?" "Command staff 1,300. They said medical logistics has to send someone." She checked her watch. "Tell him I'll be there." Castillo hesitated at the tent entrance. He was 23 years old and not good at hiding things on his face. "Is it true?" he said. "What they're saying you did yesterday." She folded the last manifest and set it on the pile. "Depends on what they're saying." "That you hit the plate." "The 4,000-meter one, yes." He stared at her. Not with mockery, with the raw, unguarded amazement of someone encountering something they don't have a category for yet. "How?" She picked up her clipboard. "I'll tell you sometime. Right now I have a briefing. The 1,000 300 briefing was in the main operations tent, a rectangular prefab space with folding tables arranged in a U-shape, a projector screen at the front that was slightly too small for the room, and the accumulated smell of 12 days of coffee and stress sweat. There were 12 people around the tables when Nora arrived. Took the last open seat, at the corner of the far end, which put Sauer directly in her sightline across the room. He was sitting between two other range officers, and he didn't look at her when she sat down. It was information. General Holt stood at the front. He looked like a man who'd had a worse morning than anyone else in the room, which was notable because it was clearly a competitive field. "Keep this brief," he said, and then proceeded not to, because the situation wasn't brief. What followed was 22 minutes of operational update covering the assessment failure, the OSC team's preliminary report, and the logistics issues that had cropped up during the range setup week. When he got to the inventory discrepancy, he said it the way people said things when they were watching to see how it landed. Medical logistics section has a flag discrepancy from last week's intake. We're doing a review. Nobody looked at Nora, which meant several people were specifically not looking at her, which was its own kind of look. "I have the documentation," she said into a pause that wasn't quite long enough to be meant for her. Holt looked at her captain. "The discrepancy in the IV solution records. I have the original intake manifest, the transit delay documentation, and the staging depot receipt. I can have copies to your office within the hour." A brief silence. Across the table, she watched Sauer's jaw shift, just slightly, just enough to tell her he hadn't expected her to say it out loud in a room full of people. "Leave it with Captain Wash," Holt said. Then he moved on to the next agenda item. It wasn't exoneration. It wasn't even close. But it was a thread she'd just made visible, in front of 12 witnesses, before anyone had a chance to quietly pull it out of the record. She wasn't sure Holt understood what she'd just done, or why she'd done it in that specific room at that specific moment. She wasn't sure it would matter. She delivered the documentation to Wash at 1340. Wash accepted it with the professional neutrality of someone who'd learned to receive things without reacting to them, which told Nora approximately nothing about how it would be used. She went back to the tent. She waited. At 1600, 3 things happened inside of 20 minutes, and none of them were unrelated. The first was that a black SUV with a federal government plate pulled through the main gate of Redstone Tactical Range and parked outside the operations building. 2 people got out, both in civilian clothes, both moving with a particular kind of deliberateness that had nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with authority. One of them was carrying a document case. The second was that Nora's phone buzzed with a message from the same number she'd been not reading for 11 days, on base. "Don't engage with Sauer or his people. I mean it." The third was that Sergeant First Class Dominguez, the NCO, who'd told her that morning that her system access was pending authorization, appeared at the equipment tent and told her, without meeting her eyes, that her credentials had been suspended pending a formal logistics review. "Who authorized the suspension?" she asked. "Range Operations Officer," Dominguez said. "Meant Sauer. It's temporary. Standard procedure for flag discrepancies. I provided documentation to General Holt's office 2 hours ago that clears the discrepancy." "I don't know anything about that, ma'am. I'm just delivering the message." He left. She stood in the tent with her suspended badge and her clipboard, and the sound of wind moving against the canvas, and she thought carefully about the 2 people who'd just gotten out of the SUV with the federal plate. On base. The message had come 17 minutes before the SUV arrived. Whoever had sent it, whoever had been moving toward Redstone since yesterday evening, was already here or had known someone was coming. She thought about what that meant. Then she went to the mess tent, got coffee she didn't want, and sat where she could see the operations building. She watched the 2 civilians go in at 1607. She watched them still be inside at 1700. At 1712, Sauer came out of the building alone, walking faster than the situation required, heading toward the berthing area. He wasn't running. He had enough control not to run. But he wasn't strolling either. She'd spent years learning to read movement. The way a person walked told you things that their face was trained to conceal. Sauer was worried. More than worried, he was recalibrating, running numbers, trying to figure out what had changed. She finished the coffee. At 1730, Captain Dolores Wash appeared at the mess tent entrance, scanned the space, found Nora's face, and crossed the room with the economy of someone delivering a message they've been given exact words for. "General Holt wants to see you," Wash said. "Operations building. 2 civilians who came in at 1600. I was asked to bring you in, Captain. All I can tell you." Nora left the coffee cup and went. The operations building's main conference room had 4 people in it when she arrived. General Holt, Director Fenn from the OSC team, and the 2 civilians from the SUV. One of the civilians was a woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the specific kind of composure that didn't come from personality, but from profession. The other was a younger man, late 30s, maybe who'd positioned himself slightly behind, and to the side of the woman, the way people position themselves when their job was to listen and remember rather than speak. Nora recognized the woman in the same moment that the woman's face shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Nora," said Deputy Director Lena Marsh of the Office of Clandestine Programs. "Sit down." Nora had not seen Lena Marsh in 4 years, 2 months, and approximately 19 days. She knew the number because she'd counted it, the same way she'd counted a lot of things she would have preferred not to count. Marsh had been the program director during the years that Nora did not talk about. She'd also been the person who'd handed Nora her medical discharge paperwork and told her, in a voice that was genuinely kind and completely final, that what she was doing was necessary and that Nora would understand eventually. She had understood. That didn't mean she'd liked it. She sat down. "I see you found each other," Holt said, looking between them with the expression of someone realizing they are the only person in the room who doesn't know what's actually happening. "We have a history," Marsh said. To Holt, not to Nora. Captain Hartwell served under a classified program for approximately 3 years before her transition to medical logistics. Program's existence is still compartmented. "How classified?" Fenn said. "Above your current clearance level, Director. With respect." Fenn absorbed that without visible reaction, which Nora thought was impressive. Holt looked at Nora. "Why is none of this in your service jacket?" "Because it's classified," Nora said. "And because when I transitioned out, the paperwork that went into my official file was specifically constructed to not reflect it." "Was the arrangement?" "The arrangement," Holt repeated. "It was a condition of her program exit," Marsh said. "Standard for this type of service. Her official record shows medical logistics because that's what she was authorized to show. Her actual record is in a different file in a different building." Holt sat back in his chair. He looked like a man reassembling his understanding of the past 36 hours from different materials than he'd started with. "So the shot yesterday was consistent with her documented capabilities in the classified record," Marsh said, "which I've just had partially declassified for the purposes of this conversation." She set a folder on the table. "Captain Hartwell's confirmed engagement record from her time in the program includes 14 precision engagements at distances ranging from 1,800 to 3,400 meters. Her qualification ceiling under program conditions was 3,800 meters. Yesterday's shot was 3,947. The room was quiet. She exceeded her own record," the younger man behind Marsh said. It was the first thing he'd said, and he said it like a footnote, but the words sat in the air differently than footnotes usually did. Fenn reached out and opened the folder. She read for approximately 30 seconds, then looked up at Nora with an expression that was hard to categorize. "Why did you leave the program?" Nora looked at the table. "Personnel loss. On an operation, you lost people." "I lost people." She didn't elaborate. The folder on the table, she knew, would have the details if Fenn needed them. She was not going to say them out loud in this room. Fenn read a little more. Then she closed the folder. "And for the past 4 years you've been running supply inventory." "Yes." "By choice." "Yes." Fenn looked at her for a long moment. Not unkindly, but not gently either. "That seems like a significant waste." "I know," Nora said. "I was okay with it." The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. By the end of it, Nora's credential suspension had been reversed. A formal review of the inventory documentation had been initiated, and Marsh had requested access to the range operations logs for the past 2 weeks, including after-hours entries. Nobody said Sauer's name in the room. But the younger man who'd been listening wrote something down when Marsh mentioned the after-hours log, and Nora noticed. When she left the building, it was past 1,900. The desert had started to cool, and the sky was doing the thing it did in Nevada at that hour, going from bleached white to a deep layered orange in the space of minutes, kind of color that looked artificial until you'd seen it enough times to believe it. She was 3 steps past the operations building door when she nearly walked into Sauer. Standing just off the path, hands in his pockets, and the way he'd positioned himself made it clear it wasn't accidental. He'd been waiting. She stopped. "Quite a meeting," he said. "I wouldn't know. You weren't in it." Something moved across his face, irritation, quickly managed. "You need to understand something," he said. "Whatever you think you're doing right now, whatever those people came here for, it doesn't change the fact that you don't belong in this program. You haven't operated in 4 years. You had one shot in a controlled environment with a cooperative wind window. It's not a qualification." She looked at him. He was taller than her by about 4 inches, and he was using it in the way that certain people did, positioning his body slightly forward, taking up space, speaking from above. She'd had worse. She'd had considerably worse. "You went into the operations office at 2,247 last night," she said. "I saw the log." A pause, controlled but real. "I had documentation to review. After hours. The day after I fired the shot. On a file that had my name on it." She let that sit for a second. "You want to tell me what documentation couldn't wait until morning? You're making an accusation. I'm stating a fact. The accusation is in the paper trail." His jaw tightened. "You're a logistics officer who got lucky with a rifle. Don't mistake that for something it isn't." "I'm not mistaking anything," she said. "You are. You thought I was nobody. You thought I'd have no recourse. You thought you had time." She stepped around him. "You don't have time anymore." She kept walking. She heard him say something else behind her, but she didn't turn around, and she didn't stop, and she didn't let herself feel the way her pulse was hammering until she was far enough from the building that no one could see her face. That night, Marsh came to the support staff berthing area at 2100 and asked Castillo and the 2 other medics to give them the tent for 20 minutes. They went without much complaint. Marsh had a quality of presence that made people comply without being entirely sure why. She sat on Nora's bunk. Nora sat across from her on an equipment crate. Tent flap was tied shut. A single battery lantern made everything amber-colored and slightly unreal. "Tell me the rest of it," Marsh said. Nora looked at her. "You have the file. I have the official record. I want the rest." Pause. Outside, somebody walked past the tent. Boots on gravel, footsteps fading. "He altered the intake documents before he knew you were coming," Nora said. "Which means he'd been watching me since, before I fired the shot. Or he had information about you that you didn't know he had." She looked up. "What kind of information?" Marsh set her hands on her knees. Composure didn't shift, which was itself informative. It meant she'd been sitting on this and had decided to put it down now, deliberately. "Sauer applied for the Phantom program 2 years ago. He didn't make the first cut. The evaluation committee's recommendation was that he had the technical skills but insufficient psychological profile for the program's specific requirements." She paused. "One of the people on that evaluation committee was your former program director. He had access to your name from committee records, not your classified record, but enough to know your name existed in that context." Nora processed that. "He knew who I was before I stepped onto the range. I think he knew you were attached to the support detachment. I think when you fired that shot, it triggered something he'd been sitting on. He wanted to preempt me. He wanted to make you look incompetent before anyone could look too closely at you." Marsh's voice was even. Clinical. It was moderately sophisticated for an improvised response. "He had the system access and he moved quickly. If you hadn't photographed those documents when you did, I would have been flagged for misconduct before Fenn's records request came back." "Yes." The lantern flickered. Wind against the tent canvas, a low sustained pressure that made the walls bow slightly inward. Nora sat with that for a moment. The shape of it, the premeditation, the speed, the specific kind of contempt required to falsify records against someone you decided didn't matter. She dealt with dismissal before. She dealt with institutional invisibility for 4 years, and had mostly made peace with it. Different. This was someone deciding that, because she looked like nothing, she could be erased like nothing. "What happens to him?" she asked. "That depends on the review," Marsh said. "The after-hours log entry is strong. The document comparison will be cleaner than he thinks. Forensic analysis on timestamps and user signatures can be very specific. Whether it goes to misconduct review or formal charges depends on what the review turns up and how cooperative his chain of command is." "Will they be cooperative?" A pause. "Holt was embarrassed by what happened today," Marsh said. "Men like Holt react to embarrassment by deciding they knew the right thing all along and simply weren't given the right information. Which means he's now highly motivated to correct the record." Nora almost smiled. "Not quite. You've always been good at reading generals. I've had practice." Marsh stood up. She was quiet for a moment, looking at Nora with an expression that had more in it than the one she'd worn in the conference room. "Why didn't you fight it 4 years ago? The transition. Could have stayed in, I know. You didn't want to. I didn't want to be what I was anymore." She looked at her hands. "I was tired. I lost 5 people on Kessler Ridge, and I put all 5 of them in the ground. And then I sat in a debrief room for 11 hours answering questions about my shot selection, and I decided I was done. And now?" She looked up. "What's happening with the Phantom program?" Marsh's expression shifted barely, but Nora caught it. The OSC assessment failed. Fenn's team needs a qualified shooter to advance the program to the next phase. And the classified record you just partially declassified makes me the only person in the evaluation window with a documented qualification at range. Marsh said nothing. You didn't just come here for the records review, Nora said. No, Marsh said, I didn't. The lantern light held them both in amber. Outside, the Nevada desert was dead quiet, the way it got after midnight when the wind finally lay down a silence so complete it felt like pressure rather than absence. Nora thought about the target plate ringing in the distance. She thought about 4 seconds of flight time and the specific quality of stillness that had come over her when she'd looked through that scope, the way her mind had gone clear and cold and utterly present in a way it hadn't been in 4 years. She thought about Sauer's voice on the range. This is for real operators, not support staff. I need to think about it, she said. You have until morning, Marsh said. I'm not trying to pressure you. You're absolutely trying to pressure me. Marsh looked at her steadily. Yes, she said, I am. Get some sleep. She untied the tent flap and left. Nora sat on the equipment crate for a long time after that, in the amber light, listening to the silence. She reached into her kit bag, found the small laminated card at the bottom, worn at the corners. She took it out this time and looked at it in the lantern light to say, it was old. The photo on it was her, but barely recognizable as the person who'd been managing inventory manifests for the past week. The person in the photo had a different face, or the same face differently inhabited. Something behind the eyes that she'd spent 4 years deliberately letting go dark. The designation on the card was a single line beneath her photo. Not her name, not her rank. A call sign, 2 words, black text on white laminate. Night Raven. She turned the card over in her hands. Put it back. She lay down on the bunk and stared at the tent ceiling and did not sleep at all. And at 430 she sat up. And at 445 she pulled on her boots. And at 500, when the desert was still dark and cold and the first gray was only just starting at the eastern edge of the sky, she walked out to the range. Nobody was there. The target plate was invisible in the dark, a theoretical object 2.5 miles out, somewhere in the black. Stood at the firing line and looked at where she knew it was. Behind her, she heard footsteps on the gravel approach path. Not Marsh, the stride was too heavy. She turned. General Holt was walking toward her in the pre-dawn dark, both hands in his jacket pockets, moving with the deliberate care of a man who'd been awake as long as she had. Bus opposite her and looked downrange. They stood there for a moment, both looking at the dark. I saw your classified record tonight, he said. The parts they showed me. She didn't respond. Kessler Ridge, he said. I remember the operation. I was a colonel at the time. Nobody at my level knew there was a shooter on that mountain. There wasn't supposed to be a public record. There wasn't. I worked it out later, over a couple of years. I knew the geometry didn't fit anything a standard asset could have done. He paused. I just didn't know it was you. I didn't know you were A. I didn't know what you were. I thought you were a logistics officer. I am a logistics officer. You know what I mean. She did. She just wasn't sure what to do with it yet. The sky was starting to lighten at the edges, that specific thin gray blue that came before color. Deputy Director Marsh is going to ask me if I'm supportive of a program reinstatement, Holt said. I want to know what I should tell her. Nora looked at the dark range, the black space where the target was. Tell her I'll give her an answer at 600, she said. Holt nodded. He stood there another moment, then turned and walked back toward the operations building. Stayed at the firing line alone, in the dark and the cold, and she thought about the 5 names she still couldn't say without her chest tightening. And she thought about Sauer's face when she'd told him he'd run out of time. And she thought about what it felt like to look through a scope and have the world go completely, precisely quiet. In the equipment tent behind the operations building, she didn't know yet that Sauer had made a decision of his own overnight. She didn't know that he'd accessed a communication system he wasn't authorized to use and sent a message to someone outside the base. She didn't know what the message said, or who it went to, or what it was intended to set in motion. She was still standing at the firing line when the first light broke over the eastern ridge and turned the desert from black to the particular burning gold that meant another day in Nevada had started. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. The message wasn't from Marsh. It wasn't from anyone she expected. It was from a number she'd seen once before, 4 years ago, the last week before Kessler Ridge. The message had 2 words and a set of coordinates. He knows. She stared at the coordinates for 4 seconds. Then she opened her map application, dropped a pin, and felt something go cold and very focused in the center of her chest. Coordinates were 6.3 kilometers northeast of Redstone's perimeter. Put them in open federal land, rocky terrain, low scrub, the kind of ground that offered coverage without infrastructure. No roads that would show on a civilian map. No reason for anyone to be out there at 503 in the morning unless they'd been out there all night. Called the number back. It rang twice, then a man's voice, low and slightly rough with cold air. You got my message. Who are you? Someone who was on the mountain with you. Not Kessler, the other one. She went very still. There had only been 2 operations where she'd had support personnel in the field. Kessler was the second. The first, a surveillance and extraction operation in a location that still didn't have a declassified name, had involved a 2-person ground team whose identities she'd never been given. Standard compartmentalization. You didn't know who was in your blind spot unless something went wrong. Something had gone wrong. What's your name? She said. Arlo Vic. I was ground support, operation designator Echo 7. You were the shooter on the ridge. Echo 7. She'd been told the ground team made it out. She'd been told that for 4 years. What do you mean he knows? Sour. He sent a communication at approximately 130 this morning from a secured terminal in the operations building. I've been monitoring the base communications net since 2200. I had reason to think something was moving. Communication went to a civilian contact in Reno. I don't have the full content, but I have the recipient identifier, and the recipient has a known connection to a private security contractor that has been trying to locate phantom program documentation for the better part of 18 months. Cold in her chest spread outward. What kind of documentation? Personnel files, specifically classified shooter profiles. Specifically, the kind that would become very valuable to people who sell that kind of information, to people who want to know who's been working in the dark for the U.S. government. She looked at the firing line. The desert was gold now, fully lit, the target plate probably visible to anyone with good optics. He doesn't have my classified file. It's compartmented. He has your name, your photo, and your call sign. Picked up more than you think from the evaluation committee records. Combined with what the OSC team has been requesting in the last 24 hours classification flags, partial declassification requests if someone was watching the DoD records system for activity around a specific set of program keywords, your name just lit up. Process that. The records request Marsh had submitted yesterday. Partial declassification had to move through multiple systems, each one leaving a time-stamped flag. Someone with access to the right monitoring software would have seen her name surface, like a flare going up in the dark. Where are you now? She said. Observation position. Northeast Ridge. Came in last night. I wasn't sure you'd pick up. Why are you telling me this, instead of going directly to Marsh? Pause. When he spoke again, there was something in his voice that wasn't quite guilt, but was adjacent to it. Because I owe you. Echo 7 went sideways on exfil. You held a position for 6 additional hours, so my partner could get out. You weren't supposed to. It wasn't your assignment. Spent 4 years trying to figure out how to say that to someone, and this is what I have. She stood at the firing line in the gold morning light and didn't say anything for a moment. Get off that ridge, she said finally. Come through the north access gate. Tell them you're a DoD contractor on a site assessment. Don't use your real name in the log. I'll meet you at the equipment tent in 20 minutes. She hung up. She stood for exactly 3 more seconds, long enough to make one decision she hadn't been ready to make at 500, but was ready to make now, and then she walked fast toward the operations building. Marsh was awake. Of course she was awake. Nora found her in the small auxiliary office off the main conference room, standing at a folding table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched, and a laptop that was open to something she angled away when Nora came in. Sauer made an outside communication at 130, Nora said. Cured terminal, civilian recipient in Reno with connections to a private contractor that's been targeting phantom program documentation. My name surfaced in the DoD record system when you submitted the partial declassification request yesterday. Marsh put down the T source. Ground support operative from Echo 7. He's been monitoring base comms since 2200, and he's coming in through the north gate in the next 15 minutes. His name is Arlo Vic. Marsh's expression changed. Not dramatically, it was more like a set of small recalibrations happening rapidly behind her eyes. Vic is alive, apparently. We were told he dropped off the grid 2 years ago. Couldn't locate him. He located himself. Is the phantom program documentation physically stored anywhere on this base? The evaluation records are in the OSC team's secured case. Fenn has it. You need to move it now. And you need to lock down the record system access that Sauer still has. She paused. He has until 600 to figure out that his communication last night created a trail. Once he figures that out, he's going to try to either complete whatever he started or cover it. Marsh was already reaching for her phone. The communication, was it a data transfer or a message? Message. Vic didn't get full content. If it was message only, he can't have transmitted documentation he doesn't have access to. He was phishing. Telling someone I'm here and what my name is and asking them to start pulling thread. She was typing as she spoke rapid, economical. Still a serious problem, but it's not a breach. It's an attempted broker contact, which is enough for misconduct charges. It's enough for considerably more than misconduct charges. She looked up. You said you'd give me an answer at 600. Nora looked at her. Yes. Is this your answer? This is me telling you that the situation has changed and we need to handle it first. Comes after. Marsh nodded once. Fair enough. Get Vic to the conference room. I'll have Holt there in 10 minutes. Arlo Vic was younger than Nora had expected, mid-30s, lean and weathered in the specific way of people who spent extended periods outdoors in harsh conditions. He had a scar along his left jawline that was old enough to have gone white, and he walked with a very slight favoring of his right leg that he'd clearly spent years training himself not to show. He showed it now because it was 520, and they were moving fast, and he was tired, and that was the kind of thing that surfaced when the performance overhead got too high. He looked at Nora when she met him at the equipment tent, and the look he gave her was complicated, in the way that looks between people who've shared something dangerous and never spoken about it were always complicated. You look the same, he said. I don't, she said. Come on. In the conference room, Marsh ran him through it quickly and professionally, which was the only way Marsh ran anything. Vic laid out what he had: timestamps, recipient identifier, the monitoring methodology he'd been using. Holt arrived at 528, looking like a man who'd slept in his uniform, which he had, and absorbed the briefing, with a progressively darkening expression. He used a secured terminal, Holt said when Vic finished. That means he had the access code. He's a range operations officer, Marsh said. He has legitimate access to secured comms for range coordination. The issue is that the communication was outside official channels, and the recipient is a flagged civilian contact. Can you prove the recipient connection? The contractor link? My office has been building that file for 18 months. Yes. She looked at Holt with a steadiness that had the quality of a wall. General, I need you to suspend Sauer's base access and have him brought to a holding room for questioning. Now, before he comes on shift. Holt's jaw moved. On what basis officially? Unauthorized use of secured communications equipment for a communication with a contact of interest to an ongoing federal investigation. That's enough to hold him for questioning without formal charges while we review the communication logs. A long beat of silence. Do it, Holt said. He looked at Wash, who was standing at the door. Find Sauer, quietly. Wash left. Nora was watching the window, a narrow horizontal slot near the ceiling that showed a strip of brightening desert sky. The light was changing fast now, going from gold to the flat, high white of full morning. Somewhere outside, Sauer was waking up, or was already awake, and didn't know yet that the night had ended differently than he'd planned. She thought about the two words in the message. He knows. Present tense, which meant by the time Vic sent that message, whatever Sauer knew or thought he knew was already in motion, already transmitted, already received by someone in Reno, who was now in possession of her name and her call sign and possibly a photograph, and who was either already working with it or waiting for next steps. The Reno contact, she said. What's the response window? If Sauer sent at 130 and expects a reply, he'd expect contact within 12 hours, Vic said. These things move slowly on the civilian side. The contractor isn't going to call him back at 200, so he doesn't know yet that it went through. No. He sent blind and went to sleep. She looked at Marsh. You can get into the civilian communications system with the recipient identifier? With a federal warrant, yes. My office can have one in 4 hours. That's not fast enough if someone on the other end decides to move on what Sauer gave them. What do you suggest? She thought about it for a moment. Problem wasn't the information Sauer had transmitted. It was incomplete and wouldn't be immediately actionable without additional intelligence infrastructure the contractor would need time to acquire. Problem was the thread it created. A thread with her name on one end. You need to contaminate it, she said. Put out a false record update in the DoD system, something that suggests the declassification request was a routine records audit, no active program involvement. Give whoever is watching the system a reason to downgrade the alert. Marsh looked at her. That's a counterintelligence move. Yes. I'm not authorized to initiate that unilaterally. That goes through the CI directorate. Can you get them on the phone in the next 30 minutes? Try, then try. Marsh picked up her phone. Nora turned to Vic. You said you've been monitoring since 2200. What else did you pick up? He pulled out a small notebook paper, not digital, which told Nora something about how long he'd been working off-grid. He flipped to the last 2 pages, 2 other communications from the range operations desk, between 2,000 and 130. One was legitimate shift handover logs, routine. The other went to a base extension I don't have mapped. Internal, not external. Someone on the base. She looked at the notebook. Who's on that extension? I'd need access to the base directory. She looked at Wash's empty chair, then at Holt, who was on his own phone in the corner, voice low. Can get the directory, she said. The base directory was a physical binder in the range operations office, which was technically unoccupied at 535, but which had a duty log that recorded every person who entered. Nora signed in, pulled the binder, found the extension in 40 seconds. It was registered to the Range Operations Support Office. Shared extension 6, personnel. She photographed the page and went back to the conference room. Vic cross-referenced the 6 names against what he'd been tracking overnight. 5 of them were routine communications activity consistent with shift work. The 6th had an unusual pattern, minimal communication during the day, a cluster of activity between 2,000, 200 and 200, and then nothing. The 6th name was Warrant Officer Philip Roan. She remembered him from the qualification day, the one who'd turned around to watch her fire the shot, who'd been shaking his head when Sauer laughed, or who'd appeared to be shaking his head. How well do you know Roan? Marsh asked. She'd finished the phone call. Her CI contact was moving on the false record update, which meant they had maybe 2 hours before the system showed a change. Holt looked uncomfortable. Roan's been on staff here for 7 months. Good performance record. No flags. He applied for the Phantom program the same cycle as Sauer, Nora said. Didn't you tell me that Sauer didn't make the first cut? Both of them, Marsh said quietly. They applied together. Roan was cut in the second evaluation round. Nora looked at the directory page on her phone. 2 people who'd been passed over for the same program. 2 people who'd watched 13 qualified shooters fail to hit a target that a logistics officer then walked up and hit cold. 2 people with access to range operations systems and motivated personal reasons to make sure that shot didn't count for anything. You need to pick up Roan, too, she said to Holt. He was already moving. What happened in the next 90 minutes was the kind of controlled chaos that looked, from the outside, like nothing. People moving between buildings at a brisk walk, a vehicle repositioned near the operations building. Change in the duty roster that pulled 2 specific people off their morning assignments and placed them in separate rooms with separate questions. Nora was not in the rooms. She was in the equipment tent, which was where Marsh had told her to be, on the reasoning that her presence in the questioning process would complicate the evidentiary record. She sat on a crate and watched the morning light move across the tent canvas and thought about Kessler Ridge. She hadn't let herself think about it directly in a long time. She'd gotten good at approaching it sideways, thinking about the elevation, the temperature, the equipment she'd used, the technical details that could be processed without emotional weight. But now she thought about it straight on, the way Marsh's question in the lantern light had cracked something open. 5 people, 2 spotters, 3 ground support operatives. She'd known their call signs, not their names. Afterward, she'd been given their names in a formal debrief, read them off a sheet of paper, in a windowless room, in a building she'd never been to before and never went back to. She'd read them and handed the paper back, and that had been the entire ceremony of it. She'd spent 4 years in inventory rooms and equipment tents, and she'd been fine with it, or something close enough to fine that she hadn't looked too hard at the difference. Vic had sat 6 kilometers away on a ridge all night to tell her she'd held a position for 6 hours so his partner could get out. She hadn't known he survived. Nobody had told her. She'd operated on the assumption that she was carrying the full weight of that night, and then she'd found out this morning that someone else had been carrying part of it, unknown to her, for the same 4 years. She didn't know what to do with that. She put it somewhere she could come back to. Casticio appeared at the tent entrance at 710 with 2 cups of coffee that were actually hot, which at Redstone at that hour was a minor achievement. I don't know what's happening, he said, handing her one, but it seems like something's definitely happening. Something is definitely happening, she agreed. He sat on the other crate. He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup in his hands. I looked you up, he said, in the public system. Your record. And? It says you've been doing medical logistics since you enlisted. No combat deployments. That's what it says. He looked at her. He was young enough that he hadn't yet learned to make his face say less than he was thinking. That's not all of it. No, she said, that's not all of it. He nodded slowly. Processing. the way young people process things that didn't fit the category system they'd been working with. Then he said, with the directness of someone who hadn't spent enough time around authority to know he probably shouldn't, "Are you going to be okay?" She looked at the coffee cup. "I think so," she said, which was more honest than the full yes she would have given anyone else. 743, Wash appeared at the tent entrance and said, "Captain, the general needs you in the conference room." Conference room had more people in it than it had at 520. Holt was at the head of the table. Marsh was to his right. Fenn was there. She'd apparently been briefed in the last hour, and she looked like someone who'd been handed a significantly more interesting assignment than she'd expected. Vic was in the corner, quiet. Two people Nora didn't recognize, who had federal identification and the demeanor of people who process complicated situations for a living, were positioned near the door. "Roan talked," Holt said. He said it flat, without preamble, the way people said things when the information was doing the work and didn't need dressing. Nora sat down. "What did he say?" "He and Sauer have been in contact with the contractor for 3 months. Contractor has a client with specific interest in identifying active and former Phantom program personnel. Roan's role was communications. He's been passing base personnel information through the internal extension as Sauer acquired it. Sauer's role was acquisition and verification. They had 3 names they'd been developing over the past 18 months. You were the third." She looked at him steadily. "What happened to the first 2? Pause. One of the federal people near the door shifted slightly. "That's under separate investigation," Marsh said. "We don't have confirmed outcomes yet," which meant they didn't know, or they knew and it wasn't good. Nora kept her face in place and filed it. "Sauer has been brought in?" she asked. "Both of them are in holding rooms." Holt's voice had the careful flatness of a man managing something that was making him angrier than he could afford to show right now. "Communication last night, my CI people have accessed the log. It wasn't just a message. He transmitted a file. Partial documentation he'd compiled from the records system over the last 48 hours. "I thought you said it was message only," Nora said to Vic. "I said I didn't have the full content," Vic said. "I didn't know there was an attachment." Marsh's jaw was tight. The file included the partial declassification summary my team submitted yesterday, which was visible in the records system before the security protocol flagged it. It included Nora's name, program association, and the call sign that appeared in the evaluation committee, records Sauer accessed 2 years ago. Call sign, Night Raven. On a file in Reno, in the hands of a contractor, attached to her name and photograph, and the information that she'd just fired a 3,947-meter shot at a federal range in Nevada. "What's the contractor's client profile?" she asked. "Who buys former operator IDs?" "Multiple categories," the female federal agent near the door said. She had a clipped voice and the tone of someone summarizing a briefing rather than entering a conversation. "Foreign intelligence services. Private security firms that operate in contested jurisdictions. In some cases, organized criminal entities with specific operational needs. Common thread is that they want to know who's worked in the dark, what their capabilities are, and whether they can be approached, pressured, or preempted." "Preempted," Nora said. "Yes." The room was quiet for a moment with the weight of that word. "The Reno contact has had the file for approximately 6 hours, Marsh said. "My CI team is working the counterintelligence angle, but we have to assume the file has already moved. Whoever the end client is, they may already have it. Which means they know where I am," Nora said. "They know where you were as of last night. This base, this range." She looked at the table. She thought about 6 hours of transmission time. She thought about what you could do with a name, a photograph, a call sign, and a specific geographic location if you were motivated and had resources. Then she heard it or felt it, almost a sound at the threshold of audible range that her body processed before her brain did. A low rhythmic vibration that didn't belong to any equipment at Redstone, coming from the north. She was on her feet before she'd fully processed it. "Does this base have any authorized aircraft inbound this morning?" she said. Frowned. "No." "Why?" She was already moving to the window. Through the narrow strip of glass, she could see a slice of northern sky, still pale. And against that pale sky, there was a shape that was getting bigger, and it was moving too low for commercial aviation, and too quiet for military rotary wing. And it was coming in fast from a vector that didn't correspond to any access point on the range map she'd memorized in her first 2 days on post. "Get your people down," she said. Now Holt started to say something, and then the first shot came through the window glass. It hit the wall 18 inches above Marsh's head. The sound came a half-second later, the flat, distant crack of a high-powered rifle from distance. Everyone in the room moved. Training was a remarkable thing. The federal agents went low, and to the door in under 2 seconds. Holt went for the floor. Vic overturned the folding table, and Nora was already behind it, grabbing Marsh's arm, pulling her down into the space behind the tabletop, scanning the window with the fast visual assessment of someone calculating angles. The shot had come from the northeast, the ridge, 6 kilometers no closer. Someone had moved from 6 kilometers to inside effective range while they were in the building, and that meant they'd started moving in the dark, before first light, before Vic had come down from his observation point. They were already here, she said. What? Marsh said. They were already here. The message last night wasn't a request. It was a confirmation. Someone was already in position. Another shot. This one hit lower, took a piece out of the window frame. Closer to the conference table, there was a shooter on the northeast ridge who knew which building they were in, which room, which meant the file Sauer transmitted hadn't just included her identity. It had included current location within the base. Vic was behind the table with them, and his face had the very specific expression of a person running calculations they don't like the results of. The ridge position I was in, standard observation point, good sight lines to the operations building. If someone moved in after I came down at 500, they had 40 minutes, she said. That's enough time to set up. We need return fire, Holt said from the floor. He had his sidearm out a 9mm that was completely inadequate for engaging a precision rifle at range. I need to get comms to security. Your security response will try to approach from the south perimeter, she said. That's visible from the ridge. They'll be picked off. Then what do you? She looked at the conference room door. Through it was the main operations building corridor, and through that was the exit to the range access road. And down the range access road was the equipment staging area, where the evaluation weapons were stored. One of the precision rifles from the Phantom program evaluation was still in the staging lockup. She'd done the equipment inventory herself. She knew the cage number, the lock code, the transit case it was in. 3,947 meters yesterday. The ridge was closer than that. I need 60 seconds to get to the staging area, she said. Marsh looked at her. That's open ground between here and there. I know. If they see you move, then they'll be looking at me instead of the building. She looked at Marsh steadily. Get everyone away from the windows, all the way to the corridor. When I'm clear of the building, call your CI team and tell them we have a hostile asset on the northeast ridge at approximately 4 kilometers. Tell them to delay any approach until I have eyes on the position. I know what I'm doing, she said, and then quieter, I know what I'm doing. Marsh looked at her for one more second with an expression that had more in it than either of them had time for right now. Then she nodded. Vic caught Nora's arm as she moved toward the door. Southeast face of the ridge, he said. There's a rock formation about 12 meters from the crest. Only position with clear sight lines to this building. Where they are. She looked at him. How sure? I was up there all night, 90%. She pulled her arm free and went for the door. Corridor was dim, all fluorescent lights and concrete block, and she moved down it fast, staying low at the window intersections, processing the geometry as she went. Staging area was a separate structure, 40 meters from the operations building, connected by an open gravel path that offered no cover for approximately 30 of those 40 meters. She hit the outside door and paused. I was evaluated. The northeast ridge was visible from here, a dark rocky line against the morning sky, maybe 3,800 meters. She looked for movement at the southeast face. She saw the glint. Morning light just beginning to angle low and hard across the desert, catching metal. They were there, and they were adjusting, moving the muzzle. Someone on that ridge had just registered the door opening and was making a correction. She ran. The gravel under her boots was uneven and loud, and she crossed 30 meters of open ground in the longest 8 seconds she could remember, the skin of her back cold with the awareness of what was behind her, and she hit the staging area wall and pressed against it, and stayed there for a half-second taking inventory of herself. No impact. She was intact. She got the staging door open. Found the cage. The lock code was 6 digits she'd memorized on day 2 and hadn't needed until now. She got the transit case out, got it open, got the rifle up, and moved to the small north-facing window of the staging structure, a utility window, 3 inches high, enough to see through if you got flat against the wall. She got flat against the wall. She had no spotter. No wind data from sensors. The ranging equipment was in the case, but there was no time to set it up. She would have to use the last wind reading she had in her head from the morning, from standing at the firing line at 500, and calculate the hours of drift and the temperature change and the distance, which she estimated at 3,780 meters, to the southeast face of the ridge. She had one shot at this. One shot to take out or suppress a hostile shooter before the range security team tried to advance and got killed for it. She looked through the scope. The rock formation on the southeast face of the ridge swam in the thermal distortion of the early morning. Not as bad as afternoon mirage, but bad enough. She searched the formation, found the gap between two rock faces that Vic's description had pointed her toward, found the barrel. Her breathing slowed. Her world went to the particular quiet it always went to, the quiet that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with absolute, unsentimental attention. She made two adjustments: wind, temperature correction. Calculated the time of flight at this distance, approximately 4 seconds. She calculated where the body behind that barrel would be when the round arrived. She held. The wind dropped. Her finger was on the trigger when her radio Holt's radio, which she'd grabbed from the conference table, crackled to life. Captain Hartwell. It was Holt's voice, tight with something she couldn't immediately read. Do not fire. I repeat, do not fire. We have personnel moving onto the ridge. Friendly's north approach. They've been there since 400. We just got comms with them. She held the shot. Held it. Who is on that ridge, she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her slightly. Pause. Then a different voice on the radio, one she didn't recognize, clipped and calm, and carrying the specific authority of someone who was used to being listened to in difficult situations. Captain Hartwell, the voice said. My name is Special Agent Dominic Farr, Defense Counterintelligence. We have the shooter in custody. Do not fire. But I need you to stay exactly where you are, because there is a second shooter that we have not yet located, and right now you are the only person on this base with the capability to find them. She lay behind the rifle and looked at the ridge through the scope and did not move. Outside, somewhere in the gold Nevada morning, a second shooter was waiting. She was the only one who could find them before they found someone else. She didn't move. That was the discipline of it, not the courage, not the training, but the specific, unglamorous act of lying still behind a rifle with a shot she hadn't taken and a target she couldn't yet see, while every instinct she had was telling her to scan, to move, to do something. 4 years of inventory management had dulled the edges of that instinct but not killed it, and right now it was very much alive, and very much insisting that staying flat on a concrete floor with her eye to a scope was the correct answer. Keyed the radio. Farr, what's your confidence on the second shooter's position? Low, he said. First shooter isn't talking. We know from pre-deployment surveillance that 2 assets were inserted overnight. We have one. The second went to ground when we took the first into custody. Direction of insertion? Northeast corridor, same as the first. They could have split before reaching the ridge. She thought about that. Split before the ridge meant one person had the high position, the other had moved laterally, standard 2-shooter deployment for a denial operation. The high position kept attention on the ridge. The second position was for a different purpose entirely, and that purpose was usually access to something the first shooter was providing distraction from. What is Sauer's current location, she said. A pause on the radio. Not static thinking. Operations building, East holding room. With a guard? 2 personnel, yes. Farr. A denial operation with 2 shooters doesn't put both assets on the same target. The first shooter was on the operations building on us. The second shooter has a different assignment. She moved her eye from the scope, scanning the broader landscape through the narrow window. Is Sauer the only person in holding, or is Roan there too? Another pause, longer this time. Then Farr's voice came back with a different quality, sharper, the tone of someone receiving information through an earpiece. At the same time they were talking. Roan is in a separate room. South Administrative Block. What's the guard situation on the South Block? Single MP. He was already moving. Get additional personnel to the South Block now. The second shooter's objective isn't the operations building. It's Roan. Someone needs to make sure he can't talk. She heard Farr relay the instruction. She was through the staging area door before she heard the response. Back into the open ground between buildings, moving fast and low, the rifle in her hands because she wasn't leaving it behind. The South Administrative Block was a separate prefab structure on the far side of the main operations building, which meant it was on the blind side relative to the northeast ridge, which was exactly why a second shooter, who'd split from the primary insertion point, would have moved there. Not to engage from elevation. To engage from close range, from inside the perimeter, while everyone's attention was oriented toward the ridge. She was 60 meters from the South Block when she heard the single shot. The MP outside Rowan's holding room was named Specialist Grace Odell, and she was 24 years old and had been on duty for 4 hours and had very little context for why a warrant officer was being held in an administrative room at 5:30 in the morning, but she'd been told to stand her post, and she'd been standing it with professional thoroughness. She heard the shot from somewhere outside the building and processed it in approximately half a second as something that required her to step into the doorway rather than away from it, which was the correct instinct and probably saved her life, because the round that came through the south wall of the administrative block missed her by 11 inches. By the time Nora came through the south block entrance, Odell was down, not hit, but flat against the wall with her sidearm drawn, breathing hard, blood on her right forearm from a fragment of wall material that had caught her when the round came through. Where Nora said, "West side, outside." Single shot came through the wall. Odell's voice was controlled, but her hand wasn't fully steady. Nora stepped past her. Through the narrow window at the end of the corridor, she could see the west exterior gravel, a utility vehicle parked against the fence line, a cluster of equipment containers. No movement, which didn't mean nothing. It meant someone who was very good at being still. Is Roan alive? Odell checked. The room's small window was on the east wall opposite side from the incoming round. Roan was flat on the floor, unhurt, making the particular sounds of a man who had just come to understand that his situation had deteriorated significantly past what he'd planned for. "He's alive," Odell said. Nora looked at the utility vehicle. The angle of the shot through the west wall, trajectory she could calculate from the entry point and where the round had lodged in the east wall, told her the shooter had been elevated slightly. Not much, maybe 2 meters. The roof of the utility vehicle, or the top of the container stack. 40-50 meters out. She keyed the radio. Far. Second shooter's as west side of the south administrative block, approximately 40 to 50 meters. Elevated position on either the utility vehicle or the container stack. I need you to put noise on the east side, anything to shift their attention, 30 seconds to the right. What are you going to do? I'm going to go out the south exit and come around. Silence on the radio for a moment. Then Hartwell, I have trained counterintelligence field personnel who are currently dealing with the first shooter and don't know this building's layout. She was already at south exit. 30 seconds of noise on the east side. That's all I need. Another pause. Then 30 seconds, starting now. She heard it, a vehicle engine, loud and sudden, from the east side of the building. Deliberate noise, the kind that drew eyes. She went out the south exit and moved along the building's exterior wall, staying in the structure's shadow, closing the distance to the west corner. The utility vehicle was visible from the corner's edge. She could see the top of it, the elevated flat surface of the cargo bed. Empty. But the container stack beside it had a lip that would provide a prone position with clear sightlines to the holding room window. She came around the corner, low and fast, and found the second shooter in the first second. Not where she'd expected. Not on the container stack. The figure was on the ground, between the vehicle and the fence, already moving, already reacting to the noise from the east side, and simultaneously processing that something had come around the corner from the south. Professional instinct, good situational awareness, fast reaction time. Fast, but not faster than someone who'd spent 3 years putting rounds on targets that were moving and unpredictable, and considerably farther away than 40 meters. She had the rifle up and the figure in her sightline before the figure completed the turn. "Don't," she said. It was one word. She said it the way she'd learned to say it, not a request, not a warning, but a statement of immediate consequence. The figure heard the quality in it and froze. The shooter was a man she'd never seen before, mid-30s, compact and well-equipped, in neutral-colored clothing that wasn't military, but had the same utilitarian logic. His rifle was half-raised, and he was clearly doing the calculation she'd known he would do, the shooter's arithmetic of angles and reaction times. "The math doesn't work in your favor," she said. "Set it down." 3 seconds. Then the rifle went to the ground. Farr's people were at the west side of the building within 90 seconds. They took the second shooter into custody, with the efficient, low-drama professionalism of people who'd done this before, zip-tied and moved to the operations building before most of Redstone's support staff had finished breakfast. Nora stood by the utility vehicle and let the adrenaline process through her system the way it always did, not with shaking, not dramatically, but with a strange flat tiredness that settled in the shoulders and behind the eyes and took time to lift. She'd learned years ago not to fight it. You used what the body gave you and then you let it recalibrate. Farr came around the corner himself a few minutes later. Compact man in his mid-40s, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that was very good at revealing nothing and was doing that now, mostly successfully. He looked at the rifle in her hands, then at her. "You all right?" he said. "I'm fine." That was he stopped, started again. Good work. She handed him the rifle. Your man on the ridge. Was he going to take the shot, or was it a warning? Unknown. The first round hit 18 inches high of a seated target. Could be a warning or an error. It wasn't an error, she said. That distance, those conditions, if it was an error, he doesn't have the capability to worry about. It was a warning. They wanted someone to run, move the target. To where? To wherever the second shooter was positioned, to take a cleaner shot. Standard displacement tactic, push the target out of a defended structure into open ground. She looked at the west fence line. They expected your CI team to evacuate the operations building when shots came through. Moving people into vehicles, out the main gate, exposed and moving. Farr was quiet for a moment. So the operations building wasn't the objective. It was never the objective. The objective was whoever was in it. Specifically whoever Sauer's transmission last night indicated had surfaced at this base. She looked at him evenly. Me or Marsh or both. He absorbed that without reaction, which told her he'd already worked it out and was confirming rather than learning. Contractor Sauer was in contact with we've been building that file for a year and a half. Client at the end of that chain has a pattern. They don't arrest people. They don't interrogate people. They remove problems. He paused. You understand what I'm telling you? I've understood it since I read the words he knows. At 503 this morning, she said. What I want to know now is whether you can trace it back far enough to close the chain. That depends on what Sauer and Roan give us. Roan is ready to give you everything, she said. He's been lying on a holding room floor listening to shots come through the wall. He knows now that whoever Sauer was working with didn't care whether he survived this morning. That changes the calculation. Farr looked at her for a moment with an expression that was close to the one Vic had worn at the equipment tent, complicated, waited. You figured all that out in the last 20 minutes. I've had a lot of time to think in the last 4 years, she said. Not much else to do in a supply tent. The next 6 hours were the kind that built toward something, without feeling like they were building toward anything. Testimony, documents, chain of custody procedures for the 2 captured assets, and the communications evidence from the secured terminal. Nora gave her account 3 times, once to Farr's team, once to Holt, once to a DU'd legal officer who appeared from somewhere around 1,100 with a recorder and a carefully neutral expression. She told it the same way each time, not because she was performing consistency, but because it was the same story, and she didn't have a different version. Roan talked. Took Farr's team 40 minutes and the tactical reality of his situation to bring him there. And once he started, he was thorough in the way that people were thorough, when they'd concluded that the alternative was catastrophically worse. He gave them the contractor's contact protocol, the communication methodology, the 18 months of intelligence gathering that he and Sauer had conducted. He gave them 3 names they'd passed on to the contractor. Nora was the third. The first 2 were former program personnel who'd been living as civilians, both of whom were now in protective custody situations that Farr's team had arranged with quiet speed. He gave them the contractor's client identifier, which Farr received with the particular stillness of someone who had been hoping for something and was now looking at it. Sauer, by contrast, said nothing. He'd requested legal representation within the first 10 minutes of formal detention and had not spoken since, which was his right, and also, Nora thought, the choice of someone who understood how deep the water was and was trying to decide whether swimming or floating was the better strategy. It didn't matter. Roan's account plus the communication logs plus the 2 captured assets plus the forensic analysis of the falsified inventory documents was enough. By 1,400, Farr told her the federal package was complete enough to sustain charges. He said it with the tone of a man reading a list rather than delivering news. What charges? She said. For Sauer, falsification of military records, unauthorized disclosure of classified program information, conspiracy to commit espionage, and pending review of the contractor communication, possible charges under the Economic Espionage Act. For Roan, same package minus the falsification, plus aiding and abetting. He looked at his notes. Both are being transferred to federal custody this afternoon. They won't be coming back. She sat with that for a moment. Spent 11 days on this base watching Sauer position himself as someone who set the terms of who belonged and who didn't. She'd watched him use the logistics system, the records, the chain of command, every institutional tool he could reach to try to make her into something that could be quietly moved aside. And now he was sitting in a room waiting for federal transfer, and the thing he'd tried to use against her had become the instrument of his own undoing. Because he'd made the specific error of underestimating how completely she could read the machinery of what was being done to her. The inventory falsification, she said. That'll be part of the formal record, documented and included in the misconduct package. Farr set down his notes. For what it's worth, and I know this doesn't fix anything, the two personnel from the original records, suppression, are going to be formally noted in the investigation record as part of a pattern of misconduct against your service history. That goes to the DoD Review Board. She looked at him. The original record suppression. The arrangement when you left the program. Construction of your official jacket. He paused. Marsh flagged it this morning. The way it was done there were irregularities. People who managed your exit used the classification protocols in a way that was technically within the rules, but effectively prevented you from advocating for your own record. That's been noted. She didn't say anything for a moment. She'd made peace with the official record. She'd made peace with the logistics tent and the inventory manifests and the 4 years of being exactly as invisible as the arrangement had made her. Or she'd told herself she had. What does that mean, practically, she said. It means your full service record, including the classified history, can be entered into the DoD personnel system under your name, properly attributed upon your authorization. You'd have an official record that reflects what you actually did. He was watching her carefully. No one can make you do that. But the option exists now, where it didn't this morning. She looked at the table, at the grain of the prefab surface and the ring from someone's coffee cup that had never been wiped off. I'll think about it, she said. At 1,600. Holt called her into his office, a small room off the operations corridor that smelled like old paper and industrial coffee, with a single window overlooking the range access road. He was behind his desk when she came in, and he looked like a man who'd aged 3 years since yesterday's briefing, which was accurate. He didn't make her sit. She didn't want to. I owe you an apology, he said. Not for what happened this morning. For before that. For how this range has treated you since you arrived. She looked at him. He was uncomfortable saying it, the specific discomfort of a senior officer admitting something that required him to acknowledge he'd had the wrong picture for a while and had acted on the wrong picture. He'd seen it before. She didn't enjoy it, but she recognized it as the real thing and not a performance. You didn't know, she said. I should have asked better questions. His jaw moved. When Sauer objected on the range, I didn't push back. When the discrepancy was flagged, I treated it as routine. I had a woman in my support staff who just fired a shot that 13 qualified operators couldn't manage, and my first instinct was to make sure the protocol was followed, rather than to ask why she could do that. Protocol matters, she said. That's not wrong. No. Protocol isn't the whole job. He looked at her steadily. Marsh briefed me on the full record this afternoon. Kessler Ridge. Echo 7. All of it. He paused. You've been carrying that for 4 years without any institutional acknowledgement. She didn't answer. That's not acceptable, he said. Shouldn't have been done that way. Outside the window, a vehicle was moving along the access road toward the main gate Federal, the kind with tinted glass. Probably the first transport. She watched it until it was past the window. What happens with the Phantom program, she said. The evaluation failed. Fenn's timeline for OSC approval. Fenn submitted an amended assessment to the OSC this afternoon, Holt said. Based on the documented shot from the evaluation window and the classified qualification record that Marsh provided. Program timeline is intact. He paused. She specifically noted that the qualifying shot was fired under circumstances that exceeded the evaluation parameters. No technical assistance. No spotter. Reduced environmental data. Under active threat. Nora looked at him. She called it the most complete demonstration of Phantom program capability the evaluation has ever produced, Holt said. He didn't quite smile, but something in his face shifted, which is an interesting thing to say about a shot fired by someone who wasn't supposed to be on the range. The second transport vehicle was visible now, at the far end of the access road, moving toward the main gate. She watched it, the same way she'd watched the first. Sauer was in one of those. She didn't know which one, and it didn't matter. Marsh found her at the equipment tent at 1,830, which was where Nora had gone after leaving Holt's office, because the equipment tent was what she knew, and she needed something she knew for a while. She was doing inventory, not because it needed doing, but because the physical routine of it was useful. Count things, record numbers, put things in the right place. Marsh stood at the entrance. She didn't come in immediately. The OSC approval came through, she said, 40 minutes ago. Nora set down the clipboard. The Phantom program cohort opens for operational deployment in 6 weeks, Marsh said. The lead precision operator slot is currently unassigned. Nora looked at her. The person who fills it would receive full reinstatement with corrected service record, current active duty classification, an operational authority consistent with their documented capability profile. She paused. Fenn requested you specifically, by name and writing to the OSC director. Outside, the desert had started cooling, the temperature dropping as the sun got low. Canvas walls of the equipment tent moved slightly with the evening air. Castillo was somewhere nearby. She could hear him talking to someone, the easy back and forth of a young medic at the end of a very strange day. I want one condition, Nora said. Marsh's expression didn't change. Condition, Vic. He's been off-grid for 2 years. Whatever the circumstances were, he came in when he didn't have to. He held a position all night on a ridge for someone he owed a debt to that he didn't actually owe. I want him properly reinstated and assessed for the program. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. That's not your call to make. I know. I'm making it anyway. Another moment, then. I'll take it to Fenn. It's not a yes. No, Marsh said. It's not. But it's not a no either. She looked at Nora with the expression she'd been wearing since the lanternlit tent the night before, the one that had more in it than the official version of the conversation. Are you going to say yes? Nora looked at the inventory clipboard. The numbers and the item codes and the handwritten annotations she'd been making for 9 days. The record of things counted and placed and accounted for. I need to know one more thing first, she said. Ask. The first 2 names Sauer passed to the contractor. You said they're in protective custody. Are they safe? Yes. Both confirmed secure as of 1,100. She nodded, picked up the clipboard, set it down again. Then yes, she said. Tell Fenn yes. Marsh's face did something small and controlled, and she turned around before it could become anything more than that, which was probably the right call for both of them. Nora stood in the equipment tent and looked at the supply crates and the item codes and the 4 years of careful, competent, invisible work that had led her, by a route she couldn't have mapped in advance, to this particular moment in a canvas-walled tent in the Nevada desert. She thought about the laminated card in the bottom of her kit bag. Then she heard the footsteps, not Marsh, not Vic, not Castillo. A heavier tread, familiar now from 2 days of proximity, and she turned to find Farr standing at the tent entrance, with the expression of someone who has received information they did not expect and has not yet decided what to do with it. Sauer talked, Farr said. She went very still. I thought he lawyered up. He did. His lawyer talked him out of it an hour ago. Said cooperation was in his interest given the weight of the package. Farr's jaw was tight. He gave us something we weren't looking for. Something that isn't in any of the records Marsh has access to. What is it? Farr looked at her with the expression of someone about to change the shape of what a person thought they understood about their own history. The operation on Kessler Ridge, he said. The 5 people you lost. It wasn't what you were told it was. She stood very still. Say that again. The debrief, you were given the official account of what happened that night and why. He paused. Sauer was a junior analyst attached to the Oversight Committee at the time. He had access to the full after-action report. The version you were given was not the full report. The equipment tent was quiet, except for the canvas and the wind, and Castillo's voice somewhere distant. What was in the full report, she said. Her voice came out level. She was very far inside herself now, in the place she went when the thing in front of her was something she needed to receive precisely, and without interference. Farr looked at her. The personnel loss on Kessler Ridge wasn't a mission failure, he said. It was a deliberate operational decision made by a senior officer who is currently serving in an active command position. 5 people you lost were ordered into a compromised position. The decision was made above your level, without your knowledge, and you were given an edited account specifically because the full account would have identified the officer by name. She looked at him. Sauer knew, Farr said. He's been holding it for 4 years. He used it as leverage not against you, but against the officer. He's been running his own information operation on the side of everything else. The desert air moved through the tent. Cold now, evening cold, the kind that came in fast in Nevada once the sun got low. Who is the officer, she said. Farr opened his mouth. And in that moment, Nora Hartwell, who had spent 4 years carrying a weight she'd been told, was the price of a mission that had simply gone wrong, was about to find out that the weight had a name, and the name was still in uniform, and the name was someone she would recognize. The name was Brigadier General Wallace Orrin. She knew the name. She knew the face that went with it, square-jawed, decorated, the kind of military portrait that ended up on recruiting materials. She knew it because Orrin had been the senior officer who'd signed her Kessler Ridge mission authorization. She'd never met him in person. He existed in her memory as a signature on paper, clean and authoritative at the bottom of a document that had sent her up a mountain with 5 people who didn't come back down. Stood in the equipment tent and said nothing for a long time. Farr let her. He was good at that, the specific patience of someone who understood that certain information needed space around it before it could be processed into something usable. "Where is he now?" she said finally. "Fort Harlan, Virginia. He assumed command of the Joint Operational Training Directorate 14 months ago." Farr's voice was even, informational. "He's been there since. Running a training directorate. Shaping how the next generation of operators learn to work. Carrying 4 years of a decision he'd made and an after-action report he'd sanitized and the names of 5 people he'd ordered into a compromised position. And going to work every morning with all of it tucked somewhere. Functional people learned to tuck things that couldn't be discussed." "Sauer's leverage," she said. "He's been blackmailing Oren. Not for money. For information. Oren has access to classified personnel rosters through his directorate. Sauer has been using that access extracted through Oren's implicit cooperation to build the target list he was selling to the contractor." Farr paused. Oren didn't know what Sauer was doing with the information. He thought he was protecting himself. He was actually providing material to a foreign-connected contractor that was using it to identify, and in some cases locate former clandestine operatives. She looked at him. The first 2 people on Sauer's list, the ones now in protective custody, one of them was located as a direct result of information that passed through Oren's directorate. "We don't know yet if there are others. The full audit is going to take months." Canvas walls moved. Evening cold, full dark now at the edges of the Nevada sky outside the tent's open entrance. Inside, the bare bulb hung from its cord and made everything sharp-shadowed and a little harsh. "Oren is going to be arrested," she said. "It wasn't a question. A federal warrant is being prepared. It'll be executed in the morning." Farr looked at her carefully. "You have the right to be notified. You were directly impacted by his decision and his subsequent falsification of the after-action record. When this goes to the DoD Review Board, your testimony about Kessler Ridge, the actual events, as you experience them, will be part of the evidentiary record. You're asking if I'll testify. I'm telling you that you can. Whether you do is your choice." She thought about the debrief room. The 11 hours. The sheet of paper with 5 names on it that she'd handed back without being allowed to keep a copy. Thought about being told it was a mission failure, operational error, circumstances beyond anyone's control. She thought about the specific and durable weight of carrying 5 deaths as something that happened because of conditions, because of environment, because of the terrible unpredictability of what combat produced. It was heavier, somehow, to know it had been a decision. There had been a person sitting in a room somewhere who had looked at a map and made a choice, and then covered that choice with a carefully edited document, and gone on to command a training directorate. It was heavier, and it was also, in a way she couldn't immediately articulate, a kind of release. Because the thing she'd been carrying had never been what they told her it was. She'd been carrying the wrong shape of it for 4 years. "I'll testify," she said. She didn't sleep that night either, but this time it was different. Previous 11 nights had been the insomnia of avoidance, the specific wakefulness of someone keeping a door closed against what was on the other side. This night was something else. She lay on her bunk in the empty berthing tent Castillo, and the others had relocated to give her space, quietly and without being asked. Which was a kindness she registered, and she let herself think about Kessler Ridge directly. Not sideways. Not through the technical details that could be processed without feeling. She thought about the 5 of them. She thought about what she'd known in the moment, and what she hadn't known, and what the difference meant now. She thought about 6 hours of holding a position alone on a mountain, because she'd been told to wait for extraction that was delayed by circumstances. When the real reason the extraction was delayed was that the decision had been made to prioritize a different objective, and the 5 people in her unit were considered an acceptable operational cost. She thought about acceptable operational cost as a phrase, as something a person had decided, about 5 people in a room. She didn't cry. She wasn't built that way, or she'd built herself away from it over enough years that the architecture was permanent. What she felt instead was a kind of grinding tectonic shift, things moving inside her that had been locked in place for 4 years. Not because the lock had been picked, but because enough of the surrounding structure had finally come down that the locked room wasn't the room she was standing in anymore. 330, she got up, found her kit bag, and took out the laminated card. She looked at it for a while. Then she put it in the side pocket of her jacket, where she could feel it when she moved, and went to make coffee. Wallace Oren was arrested at 714 the following morning at Fort Harlan, Virginia. Nora knew the time because Farr sent it to her as a text message, no words, just the timestamp and a single line, warrant executed. Peaceful. Peaceful. She supposed that was something. By 900, the news had moved through Redstone in the way that news moved through military installations, not through official channels, which were careful and slow, but through the informal network of people who overheard things and talked to people who overheard things. By 1000, there was a version of it circulating that was approximately 60% accurate, which was probably good enough. What was fully accurate, and what Holt made official in a command-wide communication at 1100, was the summary of Sauer and Rowan's charges, their transfer to federal custody, and the exoneration of Captain Nora Hartwell of all logistics discrepancies, which had been determined to be the product of deliberate falsification. He used the word deliberate. She noticed that. She was in the medical logistics tent when the communication went out, finishing the last of the inventory documentation that she'd started 9 days ago and hadn't been able to complete because of the access suspension. She heard the shift in ambient noise around the base, a subtle change in the register of voices, the kind that happened when information landed and people processed it in real time. Theo appeared at the tent entrance 20 minutes later. He wasn't alone. There were 2 other medics behind him, and a young specialist from the motor pool who'd eaten breakfast at the far end of her table for 9 days without ever speaking to her. Theo didn't say anything immediately. He just looked at her with the open, unguarded expression she'd come to associate with him. "Is there anything you need?" he said. She looked at the 3 of them standing at the tent entrance. "I'm almost done with this inventory," she said. "If you want something to do, I'm missing a count on the airway management kits. Cabinet 4. He nodded like that was exactly the right answer, and the 4 of them spent the next 40 minutes finishing the inventory together. Nobody talked much. It was good work. She'd always thought inventory was good work, the particular satisfaction of things being in their correct place and accounted for. Marsh came at 1400. This time she came inside. She sat on the crate that had become the unofficial visitor's seat in the tent, and she had a folder with her, and she set it on her knees and looked at Nora in the way she'd been looking at her since the lantern-lit conversation with something that was trying to be purely professional and not quite succeeding. "The DoD Personnel Review Board meets in 3 weeks, Marsh said. "Your full service record correction has been approved for entry, pending your formal authorization signature. Once you sign, your official jacket will reflect your complete history program service, operation records, confirmed engagement record, and the corrected Kessler Ridge after-action report, which will include a formal notation that the personnel loss was the result of a command decision made above your level, without your knowledge, and that you bore no operational responsibility for the outcome." Nora looked at the folder. "That's in writing," she said. "In writing in your permanent file in the DoD historical record." Marsh paused. "Oren is being charged under the Uniform Code of Military Justice and federal law. The charges include dereliction of duty, falsification of official military records, and conspiracy to disclose classified information through his cooperation with Sauer. The DoD Review Board will also formally address the conduct of the officers who managed your program exit and constructed your official record in a way that obscured your service history." "Who were they?" "2 of them are retired. One is still serving a colonel in the logistics command, which is somewhat ironic given where you've spent the last 4 years." Marsh's voice was dry. "He's been notified that the review board will be examining his conduct." Nora thought about that, about the specific chain of decisions that had led her from a classified program to a logistics tent, through the deliberate choices of people who'd decided her record should disappear. She thought about whether she was angry and found that she was, but the anger was clean, not the corrosive kind that needed somewhere to go, but the kind that meant something was wrong and was now being named correctly. "What about Vic?" she said. Marsh opened the folder. "Formal reinstatement with corrected service record. Effective as of this morning. Fenn's team reviewed his documented capabilities and his conduct during the base incident and submitted a program assessment recommendation." She looked up. "He's been offered an evaluation slot for the Phantom program cohort." Nora was quiet for a moment. "He'll take it." "He already did." "Signed this morning." She nodded. Outside, the afternoon wind was moving through the range in long, slow gusts, the kind that came in off the desert in the later part of the day and built over hours into something significant. She'd learned the rhythm of Redstone's wind patterns in 9 days of inventory management. She knew them the way she knew the thread count of the canvas and the squeak of the supply cabinet's 3rd drawer and the particular quality of silence that settled over the range between the last scheduled training activity and the dinner hour. She thought about leaving it. She thought about what it meant to leave something you'd made yourself comfortable in, even if comfortable was the wrong word for what it had been. "Where do I sign?" she said. The formal recognition ceremony was not something she asked for, and not something she would have arranged if she'd been given the choice. Holt arranged it, with Fenn's endorsement and Marsh's cooperation, and by the time Nora found out it was happening in 30 minutes, which was probably deliberate on someone's part. It was held on the range, not in an auditorium, not in the operations building on the actual firing line, which she suspected was Holt's decision, and which she appreciated for the specificity of it. The late afternoon light was doing the Nevada thing again, going orange and layered and almost theatrical, and the assembled personnel of Redstone Tactical Range were standing in a loose formation that was informal enough to feel real. People. Not just the officers and the evaluation team. Castillo was there, and the motor pool specialist, and Specialist Grace Odell with her arm bandaged and her chin up, and Ortega, who'd called hit in a voice flat with shock 2 days ago and clearly hadn't stopped thinking about it since. Few faces she recognized and many she didn't. Farr was there. Stood at the edge of the formation with the detached observation of someone present in a professional capacity. But he'd come, and that meant something. Vic was there. He stood with the particular stillness of someone not entirely comfortable in an official context, which she understood completely. Caught her eye when she came to the firing line and gave her a small nod that contained most of what neither of them was going to say out loud. Holt read the formal commendation first, the language of it official and precise, laying out the record correction and the program qualification and the service history that was now, for the first time, properly entered in her name. He read the Kessler Ridge notation. He said the 5 names. He said them carefully, which she was grateful for, and he said that the formal record now reflected what had actually happened and who was responsible for it, and there was a quality in the silence of the assembled personnel that told her the 60 people in front of her understood what it meant to have a name cleared 4 years after the fact. She received the commendation without speaking. She wasn't asked to speak. She was grateful for that, too. What Holt did next surprised her. Stepped back from the formal position and said, more quietly, in the register of someone speaking as a person rather than as a commander, for what it's worth, Captain Hartwell, I've been in this service for 31 years. I have been in rooms with a lot of very capable people. I have not seen what I saw on this range 2 days ago. And I mean the shot, but I also mean everything after it. He paused. I mean the whole thing. She looked at him. He was slightly uncomfortable, which was the right way to be when saying something true in public that you hadn't rehearsed. Thank you, sir, she said, and meant it. Afterward, the formation broke into the organic, low-key dispersal of people at the end of a long few days who needed to eat and decompress. Nora stood at the firing line for a while, not doing anything in particular. Target plate was visible. At this hour, the light was still good enough, and now that she knew exactly where to look, she could see it, even at distance. A small, dark interruption in the shimmer of the far desert. Fenn came to stand beside her. The OSC director had a quality of stillness that Nora had noticed in their first meeting and now understood better, the stillness of someone who spent a lot of time observing and had learned to make the observation invisible. I want to ask you something, Fenn said, and you don't have to answer. All right. When you stepped up to that firing line 2 days ago before any of this, before the records, before Sauer, before any of it, did you know what was going to happen? Nora looked at the target plate. No. Did you think about not doing it? A pause. Yes. What made you step up anyway? She thought about it. She'd been thinking about it, in the space between everything else since it happened. Why, after 4 years of deliberate invisibility, she'd raised her hand in a crowd of people who were going to laugh at her. Why? After telling herself she was done with what she used to be, she'd picked up a rifle and let the old stillness come back. They all missed, she said, all 13 of them, and the plate was still out there. She paused, and I knew I could hit it, and it felt wrong to know that and not say anything. Fenn looked at her for a moment. That's the whole thing, isn't it? She said. It's the whole story. Nora didn't say anything. She thought Fenn was probably right. She called Marsh that evening from the berthing tent, sitting on her bunk in the amber light with Castillo and the others elsewhere, and the tent to herself for a while longer. Oren's legal team submitted a preliminary filing this afternoon. Marsh said when she answered, going to contest the dereliction charge. He'll probably accept a plea on the record's falsification. Let hold. The dereliction case is complex. Command decisions in the field operate under different legal standards than direct misconduct. But the falsification of the after-action report is documented, and the paper trail is clear. He's going to face formal consequences. Whether they're sufficient is a question I can't answer for you. Nora looked at the tent wall. Sufficient. That was a word that did a lot of work. when the thing it was measuring was the value of 5 people's lives against whatever a court decided was proportionate. Do you think it's enough? She said. Marsh was quiet for a moment, the pause of someone deciding whether to answer the real question or the official one. No, she said finally. I don't think it's ever going to be enough. I think that's the truth of it, and I think you know that, too, and I think the question you're actually asking is whether it's worth doing anyway. Is it? Yes, Marsh said, without hesitation. Because the alternative is that it's in no record at all. The alternative is that his name is never in the same sentence as what he did. And that she paused. That matters. Names in sentences. The record being accurate. It matters. Nora thought about the 5 names Holt had said at the firing line, carefully, in public, attached to the truth of what had happened to them. Yeah, she said. It does. She left Redstone 6 days later, which was longer than she'd originally been assigned and shorter than it felt. There was processing to complete the personnel record correction. Took 3 working days to formally execute. The testimony for the federal case had to be given in a formatted deposition that required a legal officer present, and the Phantom program onboarding documentation was extensive in the way that classified programs were always extensive, because the paperwork was doing the work that couldn't be done in conversation. On her last morning, she ran the full length of the range perimeter before the sun was properly up 6 kilometers at a pace that was harder than it should have been, because 4 years of logistics work had taken something from her cardiovascular baseline that was going to take months to rebuild. She knew that. She'd already built the training plan in her head, the way she'd always built things methodically, accounting for current conditions, working forward from where she actually was rather than where she'd been. She stopped at the north end of the perimeter, at the fence line, that looked out toward the northeast ridge. The ridge in early morning light was just rock and scrub and the thin dark line of a trail that wasn't on any civilian map. 2 days ago it had been a threat position. Now it was just terrain. Vic found her there. He'd been on an early run himself. She could tell from the sweat and the particular expression of someone who'd been alone with their thoughts for an hour and hadn't fully resolved them. They stood at the fence line and looked at the ridge. You doing okay? He said, working on it. You same. He was quiet for a moment. I've been off-grid long enough that I forgot what it was like to be somewhere official. Everyone keeping track of where you are. You'll remember. Yeah. He paused. Or I'll hate it and wash out of the evaluation and go back to living in a tent in the Nevada desert. You won't wash out. He looked at her. You sound pretty sure. You came off that ridge at 500 after a night of surveillance to give information to someone you'd never spoken to because you owed a debt you'd been sitting on for 4 years. You don't wash out. You're the problem they design programs for. Quiet for a moment. Then quietly what you did on Kessler. Staying 6 hours. Stop, she said. I know, she said. We're even. All right, we're even. He nodded. The desert light was coming up golden and flat across the ridgeline, doing the Nevada thing, making everything look like it meant more than it did. She'd learned in 10 days not to trust the Nevada light's editorializing. The desert made everything look significant. Some of it actually was. Program cohort starts in 6 weeks, she said. Fort Caldwell, New Mexico. I know. I read the same paperwork you did. They're going to run you through the standard evaluation before they let you anywhere near the specialized track. Don't sandbagging it. I know you've been operating off-record for 2 years, and you've got habits they're going to want to see. You going to be running evaluation? No. I'm going to be in it with you. She looked at him. I'm not a program director. I'm a precision operator who's 4 years out of date. I've got as much to prove as you do. He smiled, a small, dry thing that had more warmth in it than it looked like. That makes me feel slightly better about my chances. Good. Run faster. She left the fence line and started the return leg at a better pace than the outbound, because the sun was rising fast and she had paperwork due at 900, and the body she had now was the one she was working with. Complaining about it was not part of the plan. The formal departure was not ceremonial. Put her kit in the vehicle. She signed the last of the out-processing documents. She returned the access badge to the operations desk and got a handshake from the duty clerk who'd been so neutral for 10 days and was now allowing herself exactly 1 full moment of human expression before the professional face reasserted. Holt was at the vehicle when she came out. He was in his working uniform, no ceremony to it, and he held out his hand. She shook it. For what it's worth, he said, and she recognized the phrase as the one he'd used at the firing line, which meant it was his honest construction rather than a prepared one. This base is better for what happened here. I know that sounds like something you say. I mean it specifically. I know you do, she said, and if you ever. He stopped. Reconsidered. The people I command need to see what capable looks like. Not perfect, not invulnerable. What actually capable looks like, including the parts that don't photograph well. He looked at her steadily. You showed them that. She thought about Castillo's face when he'd said, "Are you doing okay?" and meant it without agenda. She thought about Odell holding her post with her arm cut and her sidearm out, 24 years old and scared and correct in all her decisions. She thought about Ortega saying "hit" like he couldn't believe his own ears. They showed me a few things too, she said. She got in the vehicle. Farr was driving. He was heading to McCarran to connect back to Virginia, same general direction. They drove through the main gate without marking it particularly, the way you drove out of places that had been significant, because significance was internal and didn't require ceremony to be real. The desert opened up on both sides of the road, flat and enormous, and very clear in the morning light. What happens to the contractor, she said. The one Sauer was working with. Federal investigation is active. The client chain is going to take time to trace fully. Farr kept his eyes on the road. These things don't close in weeks, sometimes not in years. It's open. It's very much open. She watched the desert go by. Scrub and the rock and the occasional hawk working the thermals in the early morning air, that flat-wing tilt of something hunting without urgency. 2 people in protective custody, she said, from Sauer's list, both being processed back into civilian life with new security arrangements. Neither knew they were on anyone's radar. He paused. One of them was a woman, former program, different cohort than yours. She'd been living in Oregon for 3 years, teaching high school chemistry. Nora thought about that. A former program operative teaching high school chemistry in Oregon, not knowing that her name was in a file that had been sold to a contractor that sent people with rifles to federal training ranges. She okay? Nora had shaken safe. Farr glanced at her. She asked about you. When we told her what happened here, how the chain unraveled, she asked who figured it out. Nora looked out the window. The hawk had found its thermal and was circling now, very high, very patient. Tell her it was a team effort, she said. She's going to want to know your name. Then tell her my name. She flew out of McCarran at 1,340, connecting through Denver to Virginia, where the DoD Formal Review Board was scheduled, and where Marsh's office had arranged temporary quarters while the Phantom program onboarding processed. She had a window seat, and the flight was 3 hours, and the person next to her fell asleep before they reached altitude. She didn't sleep. She looked out the window at the Nevada desert from above, the way it looked from elevation, the particular geometry of it, the colors that you couldn't see from the ground because you were inside them. From up here, Redstone was invisible. A small arrangement of structures on a dry lake bed, indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain without knowing what to look for. She knew what to look for and still couldn't find it. She thought about that, about how much happened in places you couldn't see from altitude, how much of the actual texture of things existed at ground level, in canvas tents and equipment logs, and the specific quality of light through a narrow utility window at 500 in the morning. She thought about 10 days. How much could change in 10 days? If 10 days were the right 10 days and you stopped letting the weight of the wrong shape of things keep you in place. She thought about the 5 names on the record that was now accurate. She thought about them the way she'd decided to think about them, not as a weight she was carrying, but as a fact she was holding. Facts could be held. You could put them down when you needed your hands for something else. That was different from carrying. It had taken 4 years and an inventory tent in Nevada to figure out the difference, and she wasn't going to pretend the distinction was easy or clean, or that she'd arrived at it elegantly. She hadn't. She'd arrived at it because she'd been pushed far enough in the wrong direction that the right direction became the only one with any remaining traction. That was not a graceful way to find your footing. It was the way she'd found it, and it was enough. Cloud cover broke over Utah, and the light coming through the window was direct and sharp, and she let it sit on her face for a while. In 6 weeks, she would be at Fort Caldwell in New Mexico, running qualification drills in desert terrain, with a cohort of operatives who didn't know her yet and would have to learn her the same way she'd have to learn them through work, through the specific intimacy of operating in high-risk conditions with people whose capabilities you are betting your life on. She knew that process. It was not comfortable and it was not fast, and it produced something that was worth the cost of it. She was 4 years out of date and she knew it, and she was going to spend those 6 weeks and everything after them correcting that, and she was not going to be easy on herself about it, because easy had never been what she was built for. She thought about what Holt had said. Not perfect. Not invulnerable. What actually capable looks like, including the parts that don't photograph well. She thought that was right. She thought the parts that didn't photograph well were usually the parts that mattered the inventory at 600 when your credentials had been suspended. The 6 hours on a mountain when the extraction was late, the 11 days of insomnia that you managed by counting things and drinking bad coffee and reading a worn paperback until the cover was unreadable. Parts that were just endurance, plain and undecorated, with no audience and no commendation and nothing to show for them, except that you were still standing at the end. She'd been standing at the end for 4 years and told herself it wasn't enough. She'd been wrong about that. The desert below gave way to mountain terrain, the Rockies coming up sharp and white and enormous, and she watched them the way she watched terrain she didn't know, with attention and without assumption. Every landscape told you something if you looked at it correctly. Every position had both vulnerability and advantage if you knew how to read it. She was 41 days from her 36th birthday. She was a precision operator with a corrected service record and a classified program qualification and a deposition scheduled with the DoD review board and a kit bag that had a worn laminated card in the side pocket instead of the bottom. She was not the version of herself from 4 years ago. She was not going to try to be. 4 years happened, and the 5 names happened, and the inventory tents happened, and the 3,947-meter shot happened, and the morning on the firing line happened. And all of it was part of what she was now, and what she was now was enough to work with. More than enough. The Rockies passed beneath her, and then the high plains opened up, and the light kept coming through the window. She kept her face in it, and let herself think about Fort Caldwell, and what the terrain there was like, and what she needed to rebuild first, and how long it would take. There was work to do. She was ready to do it. That was the whole thing. Not the shot, though. The shot was real and the skill was real, and she was not going to apologize for either. Not the commendation or the record correction or the public accounting of what Oren had done, though all of it mattered, and none of it was nothing. The whole thing was simpler than any of that and harder than any of that, knowing what you were capable of and refusing to pretend otherwise, even when the room you were standing in had decided in advance that you weren't worth the attention, especially then. The woman they'd put in the equipment tent came home in a government vehicle with new orders and a corrected file, and the particular tiredness of someone who had spent 10 days being proven right about something they'd known all along. Not triumphant, not healed, not finished with the complicated work of carrying the things she carried. Clear about what she was, clear about what she owed the 5 names and what she didn't, clear about the difference between being diminished and being invisible, and how one was done to you, while the other was something you could, at any moment, choose to stop being. Chosen. The plane began its descent into Denver, the altimeter unwinding, the pressure in the cabin shifting in the familiar way of altitude dropping toward ground level. She adjusted her ears and looked out at the city, spreading below, and thought that somewhere in that city right now, there were people sitting in rooms where someone had already decided they didn't matter. Logistics officers, support staff, people whose capabilities existed in a file that nobody was reading, in a record that had been constructed to disappear them, in a category that had been determined in advance to be lesser. Some of them were wrong about themselves. She'd met enough people to know that capability was distributed more randomly and more generously than institutions like to admit, and that the system for recognizing it was imperfect and motivated and prone to protecting itself. And some of them were not wrong. Some of them knew exactly what they could do, and they were waiting in the quiet for the moment when someone left a rifle on a mat and walked away. To those people, she had nothing elegant to say. No clean formulation that would make the waiting easier or the dismissal less corrosive or the institutional indifference less exhausting to survive. Only this: the target is still out there, and you already know you can hit it. That's enough. That has always been enough. Step up.